The archive was already speaking when Sethal Own arrived. Not in words. The archive had no voice, no mouth, no intention behind its output. It was a signal, a flat, repeating electromagnetic pulse broadcasting from a structure that should not have existed on a world the Telvanni Compact had stripped bare and abandoned 120,000 years before Sethal was born. The pulse had crossed 7 relay buoys and 4 dead frequency bands before it reached the Compact's outer monitoring station at Keithra Null, where a junior signals analyst named Rithais had flagged it, classified it, escalated it twice, and then sat in her chair for 11 minutes staring at her console, because the classification she had assigned cultural recovery priority, one had not been used by anyone in the Compact in over 9,000 years. Sethal heard about the signal 6 hours later, when the Compact's Archivist General summoned him to the Hall of Record and told him he was being sent to Earth. He had not wanted to go. That was the truth of it, the part he would eventually record in his own personal log, and then delete, and then record again. He was 78 years old, late middle age for a Telvanni, whose lives stretched to 140 if the marrow held, and he had spent 51 of those years compiling the Compact's definitive cultural history of its colonial era. 11 volumes, each one a decade's work. The colonial era was the Compact's great shame. 900 worlds surveyed, 240 settled, 112 stripped of resources and abandoned within a millennium. The Compact had been an empire once, and like all empires, it had consumed what it touched and moved on when the consumption grew inconvenient. Sethal had documented every world. He had visited the ruins on Thesson Minor, where the Compact's mining operations had collapsed the planet's secondary crust. He had walked the salt flats of Ven Orath, where the atmospheric processors the Compact abandoned had slowly poisoned the biosphere over 40,000 years. He had stood in the empty basins of Drellin Reach, where an aquatic species had built a civilization of coral towers and tidal mathematics, and the Compact had drained their oceans for hydrogen extraction without filing an environmental impact assessment. The coral towers were still there when Sethal visited Bleached White, standing in dry air, beautiful and dead. He had catalogued the remnants of 17 indigenous cultures that the Compact had studied, classified, and then forgotten about when it left species that had developed language, art, religion, governance, and were rewarded for their complexity by being filed in a drawer and ignored. Earth was the 18th. The Compact's records on Earth were thin. Survey reports from the initial contact period, 120,000 years ago, atmospheric readings, geological assessments, a census of the dominant species. Sethal had read them all years ago when he was writing Volume 4. He had read them carefully, the way he read all colonial-era documents with the clinical attention of a coroner establishing cause of death. The dominant species was classified as pre-industrial bipedal mammals with rudimentary social organization and no detectable capacity for interstellar development. Tool-using, fire-mastering, language-bearing, but developmentally arrested at a stage the Compact's taxonomists called Grade 2, complex enough to notice, not complex enough to warrant ongoing observation. The survey team had spent 40 years studying them, the way one studies an interesting fungal colony. They built an observation post on a highland plateau overlooking the largest indigenous settlement in the region. They collected samples, genetic material, soil profiles, atmospheric baseline readings, and audio recordings of the indigenous language that they transcribed into phonetic notation, but never bothered to learn. They documented the language groups and the regional conflicts and the crude agriculture. And then the Compact's colonial priorities shifted to the resource-rich inner systems of the Keithring corridor. The observation post was decommissioned, and the survey team packed its equipment and left. The assessment they filed on departure contained one line that Sethal had quoted in Volume 4 and that he still carried in his memory like a stone in his throat. No significant cultural output. Retention priority. 0. That was 120,000 years ago. Now Earth was broadcasting a signal that the Compact's own classification system, called Cultural Recovery Priority 1, and Sethal Own was on a transport ship, watching the blue marble grow in his viewport, and feeling something he could only describe as dread. The transport carried a crew of 12, Sethal and his research assistant Tessing, a security detail of 6 compact regulars in light tactical armor, armed but under strict orders not to engage unless fired upon, the ship's pilot and co-pilot, and the signals analyst Rithais, who had insisted on coming because, as she told Sethal with the unself-conscious directness of someone 40 years his junior, "I want to see what is making that noise." The noise, the signal. Sethal listened to it on the approach, through the ship's audio rendering system. Stripped of its electromagnetic wrapping, the signal resolved into a pattern, a slow, repeating sequence of tonal intervals that the ship's cultural database could not match to any known Telvanni communication protocol. It was not Telvanni. That was the first thing that registered. The signal was coming from the coordinates of the old observation post, but it was not speaking the Compact's language. It could be automated, Tessing suggested. She was sitting across from Sethal in the transport's cramped observation bay, her datapad balanced on her knee, her dark eyes fixed on the viewport. Tessing was 32, careful, and had the particular brand of quiet intelligence that made Sethal trust her judgments even when he did not want to hear them. A leftover system, running on stored power. 120,000 years is a long time, but if the power source was geothermal. The post was decommissioned, Sethal said. Everything was removed: power cells, recording equipment, structural supports. The survey team filed a complete decommission manifest. I have it in the archive. Then what is broadcasting? Sethal did not answer. Through the viewport, Earth was no longer a marble. It was a world. Continents visible beneath cloud cover, ocean surfaces catching light. And something else, something the ship's sensors had been trying to classify for the last 20 minutes and kept returning error codes for. Structures in orbit, on the surface. Structures so numerous and so large that the ship's mapping software treated them as geological features, because no civilization in the Compact's database had ever built at that scale. The pilot's voice came through the intercom, clipped and professional. "Archivist Own, orbital scan is complete. I need you to see this." Sethal went forward to the cockpit. The pilot, a compact, efficient Telvanni woman named Versh, had the main display lit with a composite orbital survey. She pointed at the planet below without speaking. Sethal looked. He looked for a long time. The planet was covered. Not in the way a planet is covered by weather or vegetation, but in the way a body is covered by armor. The continents were laced with infrastructure, vast networks of structures that followed geological contours but were clearly engineered. Cities, if that word still applied, but cities implied something built for habitation, something with a human scale. What Sethal saw had no human scale. It had the scale of a species that had decided to rebuild its planet from the foundation up, and had been given 120,000 years to do it. Above the cities, above the atmosphere, in some cases hung shapes that the ship's sensors classified as vessels. They were not vessels in any sense Sethal understood. They were kilometers long. Some were longer. They hung in fixed positions above the planet's surface, motionless, their hulls catching sunlight and reflecting it in long golden bars across the cloud layer below. Defense platforms his rational mind supplied. Weapons platforms. But the word platform implied something temporary, something mounted. These looked grown, permanent, part of the sky. "The signal source is on the surface," Versh said. "Northern hemisphere, continental interior. Coordinates match the old observation post site." "What is the risk assessment?" Versh looked at him. Her expression was the one Sethal had seen on the faces of compact soldiers, archivists, and bureaucrats his entire career the expression that said, "I have been trained for many scenarios, and this is not one of them." "I do not have one," she said. "Nothing in the threat library matches this. They have not hailed us. They have not targeted us. We are being scanned. I can feel the sweep pattern, but no weapons lock. It is as though they are watching us the way we used to watch them." Rithais appeared in the cockpit doorway. She was holding her own analysis tablet, and her face had the expression of someone who has just been told a joke in a language she almost but does not quite understand. "Archivist Own, the signal has changed." "Changed how?" It accelerated. The pulse interval dropped from once per 8 seconds to once per 3. It started doing that approximately 14 minutes ago. She checked her tablet. 14 minutes ago is when we entered the outer system. They were being tracked. The signal had registered their arrival and adjusted its output. Sethal felt the back of his neck go cold. An automated response, perhaps. A proximity trigger buried in the old observation post's leftover circuitry. But the observation post was decommissioned. Everything was removed. The decommissioned manifest listed every component down to the wiring conduits. Unless someone had built something new on the same site. Sethal returned to the observation bay and sat down. His hands were folded in his lap, the 4 fingers of each hand interlaced, a Telvanni posture of deep thought that he had learned from his mentor, Archivist Calera, 40 years ago in the reading rooms of the Compact's central library. The memory arrived with its usual clarity. Calera, 70 years old and already suffering from the marrow wasting that would kill her 9 years later, seated at the long stone table in reading room 14 with the colonial-era documents spread before her like a surgeon's instruments. Her silver-black eyes, the iris rings contracted to thin lines the way they did when she was concentrating. Her hands, stained with the archival-grade fixative she used to preserve degrading paper specimens, folded in front of her chin. "You are not studying artifacts," she had said. Her voice was dry, precise, and carried the faint rasp of someone who had spent decades breathing the dust of old records. "You are listening for the voices of people who can no longer speak for themselves. Your job is to hear them clearly and to record what they said without adding your own words." Sethal had been 37 at the time. He had just completed Volume 3 of his colonial history, and was preparing to begin Volume 4, the volume that would cover the outer expansion worlds, including Earth. He had asked Calera how she maintained emotional distance when documenting atrocities. She had looked at him the way she always looked at him, when he asked a question that revealed the limits of his understanding, with a patience that was itself a form of instruction. "You do not maintain distance," she had said. "You accept proximity. You stand close enough to hear the truth and far enough away to record it without flinching. That is not distance. That is discipline." Sethal had spent 51 years trying to live up to that instruction. He had succeeded often enough to build a career and a reputation. He had failed often enough to know that pure objectivity was a myth, that every historian brings their own grief to the archive, their own guilt to the catalog. His grief, his guilt, was the Compact itself. He had documented the Compact's colonial crimes with the thoroughness of a pathologist documenting a disease. Every abandoned world, every discarded culture, every indigenous species that the Compact had surveyed, classified as insignificant and left to whatever fate awaited them. Sethal's 11 volumes were the definitive record of the Compact's imperial phase, and they were not popular reading. They were considered necessary but uncomfortable, the kind of scholarship that earned awards and empty lecture halls in equal measure. When the Archivist General presented him with the Compact's Medal of Historical Merit at a ceremony attended by 300 officials, the speech praised his unflinching commitment to the documentary record. The phrase made Sethal want to laugh. Unflinching, as though flinching were something he had chosen not to do, rather than something he had trained himself to suppress with the same discipline Calera had taught him. The compact's political leadership cited his work in speeches about accountability, while quietly ensuring that the policies that had produced the colonial era remained functionally intact under different names. The Outer Expansion Directorates had been dissolved and reconstituted as Resource Coordination Offices. The survey teams that had classified indigenous species as developmentally insignificant had been replaced by cultural assessment units that used different metrics but reached the same conclusions. The colonial era was over in name. In practice, it continued with better paperwork. The transport descended through Earth's atmosphere on a trajectory that Versh had plotted to avoid the largest orbital structures. The descent was smooth, controlled, and utterly terrifying. Through the viewport, the scale of what humanity had built resolved from orbital abstraction into specific, concrete detail. A defense wall that stretched across a river valley for what the sensors said was 400 kilometers. A cluster of structures on a mountain plateau that the sensors classified as a single integrated installation, a city-sized machine, its surface tessellated with energy collection panels, its upper reaches lost in the cloud layer. And in the air between these structures, moving in formations that the ship's military database could not parse, smaller vessels fast, angular, silent, that tracked the transport's descent with the calm attention of shepherds watching a stray animal walk into the paddock. No shots fired, no hails, no warnings, just the steady, patient observation of a civilization that had all the time in the world and knew it. Veles, the security squad leader, came forward from the troop bay. His armor was sealed, his weapon charged, and his face was the color of old ash. Archivist. Passive sensors are reading weapons platforms on the surface below us. I count over 300 in our descent corridor alone. None are locked on us, but their tracking arrays are active. He paused. The smallest of them has a power output rating higher than our ship's main drive. Are they threatening us? No, they are watching us. Every single one of them is watching us. Veles swallowed. It is like walking through a room full of people who are all being very polite, and each one of them is holding a weapon behind their back. They landed on a plateau 12 kilometers from the signal source. The site was a broad, flat expanse of engineered stone, surrounded by low hills that Sethal's geological training told him were not hills at all, but covered structures, barrows or bunkers, or something without a name in his vocabulary. The air was clean, warm, and carried a faint mineral scent that reminded him of the salt flats on Ven Orith. The sky was bright and pale blue, streaked with high cirrus clouds, and through the clouds, the silhouettes of two orbital platforms were visible dark bars against the light, kilometers overhead, their undersides glinting with what might have been sensor arrays or weapon emplacements or both. The security detail disembarked first, spreading into a perimeter formation that Sethal recognized as compact standard defensive protocol. They looked small against the landscape. They looked small against everything. Tessin was beside him as he descended the ramp. "The signal is stronger here," she said, checking her handheld scanner. "It is not a broadcast anymore. It is directional, aimed at us." "Aimed how?" "It shifted frequency when we entered the atmosphere. It shifted again when we landed. It is tracking our position." The signal was guiding them. Sethal felt the weight of that understanding settle into his bones. Not a leftover, not a malfunction. Something on this planet was speaking to them, using a frequency the compact had abandoned 9,000 years ago, from a site the compact had abandoned 120,000 years ago. He walked toward the signal source. The security detail objected. Sethal overruled them with the quiet authority of a man who had spent half a century studying the remnants of civilizations that had been destroyed by people with weapons and good intentions. "If they wanted us dead, we would be dead," he said. "We are in the center of their world. They let us land. They are letting us walk. The signal is an invitation. We will accept it." They walked for 40 minutes across the engineered plateau. The surface was smooth, a pale cream-colored composite that absorbed sound and radiated warmth. Tessie noted that the material was self-repairing. Small cracks sealed themselves behind their footsteps, the surface reshaping with a speed that suggested active maintenance at the molecular level. Veles, walking 3 paces behind them with his weapon at rest, pointed out that the plateau's edge was bordered by a series of low structures that his tactical scanner identified as sensor nodes. "They are tracking our footsteps," he said. "Individual weight, gait pattern, biometric signature. They have been tracking us since we stepped off the ramp." Sethal nodded but did not slow down. The hills around them rose higher as they walked, their surfaces covered with what Sethal initially mistook for weathered rock, but which, on closer inspection, resolved into carved panels, thousands of them, each one bearing symbols in a script he did not recognize. "Writing," Tessin said, scanning a panel. "Consistent symbol set, at least 300 unique characters. This is not decorative, this is text." "Can you read it?" "Not yet, but the system is cross-referencing against the old survey records. Some of the base symbols match pre-industrial script samples from the compact's original assessment." "The same species?" "The same people the compact had classified as having no significant cultural output. 120,000 years later, their writing covered hills that were the size of mountains. The signal source appeared ahead of them, not a structure, not a tower, not anything Sethal's expectations had prepared him for. It was a depression in the plateau, a wide, circular basin, perhaps 200 meters across, with steps leading down into it like the interior of an amphitheater. The steps were carved from the same pale composite as the plateau's surface, and on every riser, on every step, symbols were inscribed. At the center of the basin stood a single figure. Human. Sethal had seen representations of the species in the old survey files: bipedal, variable pigmentation, bilateral symmetry. The person standing in the basin matched those representations in the broadest terms and diverged from them in every detail that mattered. The survey files showed a species that was short, fragile, and wrapped in crude textiles. The person at the center of the basin was tall, taller than Sethal by a head, and stood with the bearing of someone who had been waiting and did not mind the wait. The person wore a simple garment in dark gray, no armor, no visible weapons, no insignia. The face was weathered, lined, calm. Old. Not old in the way the Telvanni measured age, but old in the way that stone is old, marked by time, shaped by it, undiminished by it. The figure raised one hand, palm open, and waited. Sethal descended the steps alone. His security detail remained at the rim, their weapons lowered, their expressions tight. Tessin stood at the top of the steps with her scanner running and her mouth pressed into a thin line. The walk down was longer than it looked. The steps were shallow and wide, designed for a stride longer than Sethal's, and the symbols on the risers blurred past him as he descended page after page of a text he could not read, arranged in concentric circles that spiraled inward toward the figure at the center. The air in the basin was warmer, and the mineral scent was stronger. The signal, the electromagnetic pulse that had crossed 7 relay buoys to reach the compact's monitoring station, was coming from beneath his feet. The basin itself was the transmitter. He reached the center. The human regarded him with an expression that Sethal, with his 51 years of studying the faces of the dead through their artifacts, could only classify as patience. "My name is Sethal Own," he said. His translator rendered it into the pre-industrial language samples from the old survey. "I am a historian. I represent the Telvanni compact." The human tilted her head slightly. When she spoke, her voice was low and unhurried, and the translator fed Sethal a rendering that arrived with a half-second delay, and the faintly apologetic tone of software working at the edge of its capacity. "I know what the compact is," the human said. "My name is Warden Karis Adal. I am the custodian of this archive." Sethal looked at the basin around him, the steps, the symbols, the carved panels on the hills above. What archive? The warden smiled. It was a small, tired expression, the smile of someone who has answered the same question many times and does not resent it. This one, she said, and she extended her hand toward the steps, the risers, the carved surfaces that surrounded them in every direction. All of it. Every symbol you have been walking over for the last 20 minutes is a record. Every panel on the hills above us is a record. You are standing in the middle of the largest cultural preservation archive on this continent. What does it preserve? Karis Adal looked at him for a long moment. The patience in her face deepened into something older, something that carried weight. You. The word landed without force. It did not need force. It arrived the way an archaeological discovery arrives, not with a crash but with a settling, a quiet rearrangement of everything he thought he knew. We preserved you, the warden said. Your artifacts, your language samples, your genetic surveys, your cultural assessments, your survey team's personal effects. Everything the compact left behind when it abandoned this world 120,000 years ago. We gathered it, and we kept it, and we maintained the environmental conditions necessary for its preservation for longer than your civilization has kept written records. Sethal's mouth was dry. Why? Because you left it, because someone made it, because it existed and therefore it mattered and therefore it deserved to survive. She turned and walked toward a section of the basin floor that was slightly raised, a platform, he realized, with a surface that was not stone but glass. Beneath the glass, visible in the pale daylight, was a chamber, and in the chamber, arranged on shelves that descended into the earth as far as the light could reach, were objects. Telvanni objects. Sethal knelt. His knees touched the warm composite surface, and he pressed his four-fingered hands flat against the glass, and he looked down. He recognized the objects. Not individually, he had never seen these specific items before, but he recognized their forms, their materials, their purpose. Ceremonial bowls from the observation post's mess hall, data tablets in the old compact script, personal items, a grooming implement, a meditation stone, a reading lamp with the spiral filament that the compact had stopped manufacturing 80,000 years ago. Small things, ordinary things. The debris of daily life, preserved with a care that made the compact's own museum collections look negligent. How deep does it go? He asked. 14 levels. Approximately 300 meters. The upper levels contain physical artifacts. The lower levels contain environmental reconstructions, rooms built to replicate the conditions of your observation post, including atmospheric composition, lighting spectrum, and ambient sound. We recorded everything we could before the original structures degraded, and we rebuilt them underground where the conditions could be controlled. Sethal closed his eyes. Behind his eyelids the darkness was warm and vast, and in the darkness he could see the face of Archivist Calera, his mentor, telling him 40 years ago, "Your job is to hear them clearly and to record what they said without adding your own words." But there were no words for this. The compact had come to this world, studied its people like interesting specimens, decided they were insignificant, and left. And those insignificant people had spent 120,000 years preserving the compact's discarded belongings, with a devotion that the compact had never shown to anyone else's heritage, including its own. "I need to see it," he said, "all of it." Karis Adal nodded. "That is why we brought you here." The archive tour lasted 11 hours. Sethal knew this because Tessin was logging the time on her datapad, her face growing progressively more unreadable as the hours accumulated. The warden led them down through the levels, each one sealed with environmental controls that adjusted as they descended, the temperature and humidity shifting to match the conditions of the original Telvanni observation post. The precision was extraordinary. By the fourth level, Sethal's body had stopped registering the environment as alien. It felt like home. It felt like the reading rooms of the central library where Calera had taught him, the air dry and cool and faintly electric with the residual charge of old data storage. Each level was organized by category. Level 1, personal effects. Level 2, scientific instruments. Level 3, cultural artifacts, artwork, ceremonial objects, decorative items that the survey team had used to furnish their living quarters. Level 4, biological samples, preserved tissue, genetic material, seed stock from plants the survey team had brought from Telvanni homeworlds. Level 5, language records. Sethal stopped at level 5. The chamber was circular, its walls covered with transcriptions, Telvanni script rendered in human-made materials, each character reproduced with a fidelity that his own handwriting could not match. Beside each transcription was a parallel text in the human script he had seen on the steps above. Translation. Someone, many someones, over many generations had learned to read Telvanni, and they had translated every document the survey team left behind. Who did this? He asked. Generations, the warden said. The first translations were crude. The early linguists worked from context and inference. It took approximately 8,000 years to develop a reliable grammar. After that, the work accelerated. By the time we had achieved spaceflight capability, the translation project was essentially complete. 8,000 years to learn a dead language. Sethal had spent 12 years learning Thessani archaic script, and he had considered it a significant scholarly accomplishment. The Compact's own linguists, with access to living speakers and full grammatical databases, had never successfully reconstructed the dead languages of the colonial-era survey worlds. They had the tools. They had the funding. They lacked the patience. 8,000 years of patience was not something the Compact's institutional culture could produce. It was not something any civilization Sethal had studied could produce. Except this one. Tessing was running her fingers along the inscriptions on the wall, her scanner recording every character. The translation quality improves over time, she said. The earliest attempts are phonetic approximations. By the middle period, the grammar is fully internalized. The latest entries, dated to approximately 30,000 years ago, are indistinguishable from native Telvanni composition. They are not translating anymore. They are writing in our language as though it were their own. Sethal felt something shift inside him. A weight he had carried for decades, the professional assumption that the Compact's abandoned worlds were passive victims of imperial negligence, cracked along a fault line he had never noticed. This world had not merely survived. It had absorbed the Compact's language, its writing system, its archival conventions, and it had mastered them with a thoroughness that made the Compact's own scholarship look like rough notes. "You are quiet," the warden observed. "I am listening," Sethal said. "That is what historians do." Level 6 held something that made him stop walking and stand still for a long time. Portraits. Thousands of them covering every wall, rendered in a medium he did not recognize, not paint, not digital display, but something organic, a bioluminescent substrate that gave each image a faint, warm glow. The portraits were of Telvanni individuals, survey team members. Each one was labeled with a name, a role, and a date ranged the period of their assignment to the observation post. The faces were reconstructed from the survey team's personnel files, cross-referenced with physical descriptions in the team's personal logs, and rendered with an attention to detail that made Sethal's chest hurt. He recognized some of the names from the decommission manifest. Survey Director Then Valleys, who had overseen the observation post for its last 11 years, and who had signed the departure order with a notation that read, "Site of minimal scientific interest. No further study warranted." Geological specialist Morin Keith, who had collected 17,000 soil samples and left them in a storage locker when the post was decommissioned, because shipping weight was at a premium and soil from a primitive world was not worth the cost. Cultural observer Pelun Driss, who had written the assessment that dismissed the indigenous species as culturally insignificant. Sethal stood in front of Pelundris's portrait for a long time. It was a kind face, rendered with care by someone who had never met its owner, but who had read enough of her words to understand the shape of her expressions. The reconstruction showed her at approximately the age she would have been during her posting, middle-aged by Telvanni standards, the skin around her eyes carrying the fine lines that came from years of detailed observation work. The portrait artist had captured something in the set of her jaw, the slight forward tilt of her head, that suggested a woman who looked at things with genuine attention. She had been dead for 120,000 years. She had been preserved by the species she considered beneath notice. The warden stood beside Sethal without speaking. She let him look. "Did they hate her?" he asked. "The people who made this portrait. Did they hate the person who wrote that assessment?" Karis Adal considered the question. The earliest generation probably did. The assessment was not flattering, but hatred is not what sustains a project for 120,000 years. Something else sustained it. What? The understanding that a person is more than the worst thing they ever wrote. She nodded toward the portrait. Pelundris also kept a personal journal. We found fragments of it in the observation post debris. In one entry, she describes watching an indigenous child play a counting game with stones in the dirt outside the post's perimeter fence. She spent 4 pages describing the child's method. The entry concludes, "Remarkable pattern recognition for a prelinguistic developmental stage. I should study this further." She never did. The post was decommissioned 3 months later. A woman who saw remarkable pattern recognition in a child's game and still classified the entire species as having no significant cultural output. The contradiction was not unusual. Sethal had found similar contradictions in every colonial-era archive he had studied. The individual observers were often perceptive, careful, even sympathetic. The institutional conclusions they produced were not. The system consumed the nuance and output the verdict, and the verdict was always the same: insignificant, unworthy, not worth the cost of further study. The irony of the portrait was not lost on Sethal. The irony was the entire point. He thought of Calera again. He thought of Ven Orath, the salt world, where the compact's abandoned atmospheric processors had killed everything that lived there over 40,000 years of slow poisoning. He thought of the 17 indigenous cultures he had documented in his volumes, 17 species the compact had surveyed, classified, and left to their fates. How many of them had survived? How many of them had built something from the wreckage the compact left behind? The answer, as far as Sethal knew, was one. This one. Earth, the world the compact had judged least likely to produce anything of significance. "I owe you an apology," he said to the warden. Karis Adal shook her head. "You do not. You did not make the decisions that were made here. You study them. That is a different act." "Is it?" "Yes. The people who came here 120,000 years ago did not understand what they were looking at. They saw a young species and judged it by the metrics of their own development. That is a failure of imagination, not a failure of character. Your work, your volumes, your career exists to prevent that failure from being repeated." Sethal stared at her. "You have read my work." "We have read everything the compact has produced in the last 60,000 years. Your signal encryption is not as secure as you believe." The matter-of-factness of the statement settled into the air between them. Sethal absorbed it the way he absorbed all information, slowly, thoroughly, with a professional detachment that he knew was partly genuine and partly a defense mechanism against the scale of what he was being told. They had read everything. They had listened to the compact for 60,000 years, monitoring its communications, decrypting its archives, learning its history with the same methodical patience they had applied to learning its language. The compact had been observed for longer than it had been observing anyone. He descended to level 7 and kept walking. Level 7 was sound. Sethal did not understand what that meant until the warden activated the chamber's playback system, and the room filled with voices. Telvanni voices. Not recordings. The observation post's audio equipment had been removed during decommission. These were reconstructions, built from the phonetic patterns in the survey team's written logs, matched against the tonal profiles of Telvanni speech that the compact's own cultural database provided. The humans had reverse-engineered the sound of a language they had only ever seen in writing, and they had done it with enough accuracy that Sethal recognized the regional dialect. The voices were speaking in the cadence of the old Northern Reach, the dialect of the compact's colonial administrative class. The dialect Calera had spoken. The dialect Sethal's grandparents had spoken before the Northern Reach provinces were absorbed into the central government 400 years ago. He stood in the center of Level 7 and listened to dead people speak in a language that a species of no significant cultural output had learned to reconstruct from written fragments over the course of millennia. Tessin was recording. Her hands were shaking. Sethal noticed but said nothing. His own hands were steady, but only because he had locked them behind his back in the old archivist's posture, the one Calera used when she needed to be still, and the world would not let her. Level 8 contained what the warden called contextual reconstructions, scale models of the original observation post, the surrounding landscape as it existed 120,000 years ago, and the indigenous settlement that had been located 6 kilometers from the post. The models were precise enough that Sethal could identify the structural engineering of the post's main building and compare it to the design specifications in the decommission manifest. The models matched exactly. Level 9 held the environmental data, 120,000 years of climate records, geological surveys, atmospheric composition readings, and ecological assessments, recorded continuously from the day the compact left to the present. The data was stored in a format that took Tessin 3 hours to decode, but when she did, the scope of it made her sit down on the chamber floor and press her hands against her face. "They never stopped watching the sky," Tessin said. Her voice was muffled by her hands. 120,000 years. They tracked every object that passed through this system, every comet, every probe, every stray signal. They cataloged it all. They were waiting for someone to come back. "Waiting," the warden corrected gently. "Preparing, there is a difference." Level 10 held the records of how humanity had spent the intervening years. This was not the archive's purpose. The archive was about preserving Telvanni heritage, but the warden explained that context was considered essential. "You cannot understand what was preserved without understanding who preserved it," she said. Sethal spent 2 hours on Level 10. He read the compressed history, a timeline that began with the compact's departure and traced humanity's path from pre-industrial fragmentation through what they called the consolidation. The long, grinding process of unifying the species, rebuilding the planet's damaged ecosystems, developing interstellar capability, and constructing the defense infrastructure that now covered the world. The timeline was not triumphant. It recorded wars, plagues, ice ages, near extinctions, centuries of stagnation, periods of regression. The line from the compact's departure to the present was not a smooth upward curve. It was a ragged, broken, stubborn crawl, marked by disasters that would have ended most civilizations and recoveries that defied every model Sethal had for cultural resilience. And through all of it, through every catastrophe, every dark age, every period when the species teetered on the edge of extinction, someone had maintained the archive. Someone had descended to these levels, checked the environmental controls, cleaned the cases, repaired the substrates, and climbed back out into whatever was burning above them. The maintenance logs ran continuously for 120,000 years. There were no gaps, not one. The warden pointed to one entry in the log. It was dated to a period the timeline identified as the third regression, a 6th-century collapse triggered by an asteroid impact that had killed 40% of the population, and plunged the planet into a decade of nuclear winter. The entry was brief. It read, "Environmental controls stable, artifact inventory complete, no degradation detected, external conditions severe, custodian rotation on schedule." This was written during a famine that killed 300 million people, the warden said. The custodian who wrote it walked 9 kilometers through ash and darkness to reach the archive entrance. She checked every level. She repaired a humidity seal on level 4. She climbed back out and walked 9 kilometers home. She did this every week for 11 years, until the ash cleared and the next custodian took over. "What was her name?" Sethel asked. "Ashavelin. She is commemorated on the surface, on the 7th panel from the eastern stairs. Her maintenance logs are considered foundational texts in the custodial tradition. A woman who had walked through the end of the world every week for 11 years to tend the belongings of aliens who had called her ancestors insignificant." Sethel filed the name in his memory the way he filed every name that mattered, carefully, permanently, without sentiment, but with the full weight of what it represented. Sethel stood in level 10 and looked at the maintenance logs and thought about the people who had written them. Thousands of custodians, tens of thousands probably. An unbroken chain of individuals who had been born, had learned the archive systems, had spent their working lives tending a collection of artifacts left behind by aliens who considered their ancestors insignificant, and had died and passed the work to the next custodian. He thought about Calera, who had spent her entire career documenting the compact's failures, and who had died believing that documentation was the only meaningful response to institutional harm. She had been wrong about that too. Documentation was one response. Preservation was another. Calera had recorded what the compact had done. The humans had preserved what the compact had left behind. Both acts were forms of memory, but only one of them had turned memory into something that could outlast the institution that created it. Why? The question circled back again and again, like a signal repeating on a dead frequency. Why preserve the heritage of a civilization that had dismissed you? Why maintain for 120,000 years what could have been destroyed in an afternoon? He asked the warden. They were sitting on a bench on level 11, the deepest accessible level, which contained what Karis called the quiet rooms. These were chambers designed for contemplation, their walls bare, their lighting low, their acoustics tuned to a silence so deep that Sethel could hear his own heartbeat. The bench was carved from a single piece of the pale composite, worn smooth by generations of custodians who had sat here and thought about what they were tending. "You keep asking why," Karis said, "as though there must be a strategic reason, a calculation. In my experience, civilizations preserve what serves them. Heritage is a political tool. Archives are instruments of identity." "Yes, sometimes, but that is not the only reason to keep something." She paused. Her face in the low light was a map of lines, each one earned, none of them smooth. 120,000 years ago, a group of people came to this world from very far away. They lived here for a time. They studied us. They built things. They ate meals and slept and argued and worked. And then they left, and they took everything they considered valuable, and they left behind everything they considered worthless. She looked at him. The things they considered worthless were the most human things they possessed. The personal objects, the daily use items, the worn-down tools and the chipped bowls and the reading lamps they left on their desks, the things that carried the shape of their hands and the pattern of their habits. We kept those things because they were evidence that real people had been here. Not a survey team, not a classification number, people. And people deserve to be remembered, regardless of what they thought of us. Sethel felt the words land in the place where his professional detachment lived, and he felt that detachment crack. Not break. 51 years of practice does not break, but crack. The way a sealed vault cracks when the pressure differential finally exceeds what the seal was designed to contain. He had documented 17 abandoned worlds, 17 indigenous cultures dismissed and forgotten. On 16 of those worlds, the Compact's departure had been the end of the story. The cultures had survived or they had not, but in either case, they had not looked back. They had not gathered the debris the Compact left behind and tended it for millennia. They had not built underground chambers to preserve the reading lamps and the grooming implements and the meditation stones of people who had considered them unworthy of attention. Only Earth had done that, only humans. And the reason was not revenge or strategy or the accumulation of intelligence for a future confrontation. The reason was a principle so simple that Sethal's entire field of study had been built on it, and yet somehow, in 51 years, he had never seen it practiced at this scale. The belief that everything someone makes carries a piece of who they were, and that piece deserves to survive. He sat on the bench in the quiet room for a long time. Tessing came down twice, checked on him, and left. The security detail had been invited to a surface facility, where they were provided with food and water by humans who treated them with a courtesy so thorough and so lacking in condescension that the squad leader, a career soldier named Veles, later described it to Sethal as the most unsettling meal of my life. On level 13, below the quiet rooms, the warden showed him one more thing. It was a small chamber, no larger than a personal quarters, and it contained a single wall-mounted display. The display was dark until Karis touched it, and then it lit with a list. Names. Thousands of names, scrolling slowly, each one accompanied by a date range and a single-line notation. Every custodian, the warden said. From the first Ashen Tai, who lived in the settlement 6 kilometers from the observation post, and who walked to the abandoned site every day for 40 years to make sure the structures were still standing, to the most recent. Every person who tended this archive is recorded here. The list scrolled. The names changed different naming conventions across different eras, different scripts, different traditions, but the format remained constant. Name, dates, duty, an unbroken chain of human beings who had chosen to spend their lives keeping something that did not belong to them, for someone who might never come back to claim it. Sethal counted the names as they scrolled. He stopped counting at 4,000. How many? He asked. 11,642, the warden said, as of this morning. 11,000 people, across 120,000 years, each one a life spent in service to a principle that the Compact's own philosophers had never managed to articulate with the clarity of a broken bowl on a shelf. When Sethal climbed back to the surface, the light had changed. The sun was lower, casting long golden bars across the plateau. The hills, the archive's upper structure, glowed in the late light, their carved panels throwing shadows that made the symbols look like they were moving. The orbital platforms above caught the sunset and reflected it downward, bright points in the deepening blue. The warden was waiting at the top of the steps. She had not asked him to hurry. She had not asked him anything. She had let him sit in the quiet room for as long as he needed, the same way the archive let its contents sit for as long as they needed, which was forever. I have a question, Sethal said, a professional one. Ask it. The signal, the one that reached us, it was broadcasting on a compact frequency that has been dead for 9,000 years, a frequency we abandoned. How did you know we would hear it? The warden looked at him. The sunset caught her face and turned the lines into gold. We did not know, she said. We have been broadcasting that signal on that frequency for 87,000 years, every day, without interruption. We broadcast it because the frequency was the last one your survey team used before they departed. It was the last channel that carried Telvanni voices from this world. We kept it open. 87,000 years. A signal sent every day for 87,000 years on the chance that someone might be listening. The chance that someone might come back. You were patient, Sethal said. We were ready, the warden said. There is a difference. He thought about that. He thought about the 11 volumes he had written, the careful documentation of every world the compact had abandoned, every culture it had dismissed, every indigenous species it had classified and filed and forgotten. He thought about Archivist Calera, who had taught him to listen for the voices of the dead. He thought about Pelun Driss, whose reconstructed face looked down from a wall 14 levels below his feet, preserved by the grandchildren of the people she had judged unworthy of notice. And he thought about the signal, 87,000 years of a single note repeated every day on a dead frequency aimed at the stars. Not a weapon, not a warning, an invitation, come back. We kept your things. We kept the evidence that you were here. Come and see what we did with the time you gave us. He turned to Tessin. Prepare a full archival survey. Every level, every chamber, every artifact. I want a complete catalog in the compact's standard format, cross-referenced against the decommissioned manifest and the original survey records. Tessin's datapad was already open. Timeline. However long it takes, we are not leaving until the record is complete. Tessin nodded. She did not ask why. She had spent 7 years as his assistant, and she understood that when Sethal Own said the record, he meant something more than a catalog. He meant the truth. The warden watched this exchange with an expression Sethal had seen before on the faces of the humans who had served them food, on the faces of the silent figures in the angular vessels that had tracked their descent, on the face of every person he had encountered on this planet. It was not triumph. It was not satisfaction. It was not pity. It was the expression of someone who has been keeping a candle lit in an empty room for a very long time, and who has just heard a knock at the door. Sethal set up his field station on the plateau surface, within sight of the basin steps. Over the following days, he and Tessin worked through the archive level by level, cataloging every artifact, photographing every inscription, recording every environmental parameter. The security detail relaxed into a routine that involved patrolling a perimeter that no one threatened and eating meals that no one charged them for. Veles told Sethal on the second evening that the human food was carefully prepared to be compatible with Telvanni biology. They knew what we could digest before we arrived, he said. They have our nutritional profiles on file. They have had them for longer than our own military medical corps. The information settled into Sethal's growing catalog of revelations like another artifact on a shelf, one more piece of evidence that this species had been studying the compact with the same attention the compact had once aimed at them, but for far longer and with considerably more respect. Rithais, the signals analyst, spent her days in the basin, mapping the transmitter array that the archive's foundation concealed. She reported that the transmitter was powered by a geothermal tap that drew energy from a magma channel 4 kilometers below the surface, a power source that would function, by her calculations, for another 200,000 years without maintenance. She also discovered that the transmitter was not the only signal source on the planet. Her long-range scans identified 47 similar installations on other continents, each one broadcasting on a different frequency, each one aimed at a different sector of the sky. 47 dead compact frequencies, she said, her voice carrying the particular flatness of someone who has been professionally astonished one too many times in a single week. Every frequency the compact has used and abandoned in the last 90,000 years. They kept every channel open, every single one. The signals would have continued broadcasting for longer than the compact had existed, whether or not anyone ever came to answer them. On the third day, Tessin came to Sethal with a discovery that she presented in the flat, controlled voice she used, when something had shaken her badly enough that emotion would compromise the data. The carved panels on the hills, she said. I have decoded a section, 63 panels on the northern slope. What do they say? They are a record of the compact's colonial assessment of Earth, every page of the original survey report transcribed into human script, every measurement, every classification, every personnel note, including the final assessment. No significant cultural output, Sethal said. He knew the line by heart. Yes, that line is carved into the 63rd panel. Below it, in a different hand added later, the dating suggests approximately 900 years after the original transcription, there is an annotation. What does it say? Tessin looked at her datapad. Her voice did not waver, but her jaw was tight. The annotation reads, "They were wrong about us. We keep this to remember that they were wrong and to ensure that we never make the same mistake about anyone else." Sethal stood very still for a long time. 900 years after the compact left, some anonymous human scribe had carved a correction into stone, not in anger, not in accusation, in correction. The way an archivist corrects an error in the record without malice, without editorializing, with only the quiet insistence that the record be accurate. On the fourth day, the warden brought Sethal to a chamber he had not yet visited. It was on level 14, below the custodian rolls, in a section of the archive that was sealed with environmental controls more stringent than anything above it. The air inside was cold, dry, and perfectly still. The lighting was a faint amber glow that came from the bioluminescent substrate on the walls. The chamber contained a single object. It sat on a pedestal in the center of the room, enclosed in a transparent case that Sethal's instruments identified as a metamaterial composite with a structural integrity rating higher than the hull of the compact's heaviest warship. Inside the case, illuminated by the amber glow, was a bowl. A Telvanni ceremonial bowl. Small, unadorned, made of fired clay in the traditional style of the compact's earliest colonial period. The kind of bowl that survey teams used for daily meals, not valuable, not decorative, not significant by any metric the compact used to classify cultural output. It was the most carefully preserved object in the archive. "This was the first artifact recovered after your people departed," the warden said. "A child found it in the debris of the observation post. The child's parent recognized it as something that belonged to the visitors. They kept it. When the first archive was built, a simple shelter, nothing like this, the bowl was the first object placed inside." Sethal looked at the bowl through the case. It was cracked. A single fracture line ran from the rim to the base, sealed with a repair compound that his instruments dated to approximately 118,000 years ago. Someone had mended it. Someone had held this small, insignificant, daily-use object in their hands and decided that it was worth fixing. 120,000 years of preservation, 14 levels of environmental chambers, a transmitter broadcasting into empty space for 87,000 years, an entire civilization's commitment to the principle that what exists deserves to survive. And it started with a child picking up a broken bowl. Sethal pressed his hands against the case. The metamaterial was cold against his fingers. Through the transparency, the bowl sat in its amber light, cracked and mended and whole. He stood there for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, but the steadiness cost him something. "I will record this," he said. "All of it, accurately, completely, without editorializing and without apology." "I know," the warden said. "That is why the signal called you." He looked at her. "You were the one we were waiting for," she said. "Not the compact, not a diplomat, not a general, a historian, someone whose job is to listen and to record what they hear." She paused. "We broadcast the signal for 87,000 years. We could have waited 87,000 more. We were in no hurry. The archive is patient." "We learned patience from the same place. We learned everything else from the long years after you left, when we had nothing but time, and the things you did not think were worth carrying home." Sethal removed his hands from the case. He straightened his back, the way Calera had taught him to stand when the weight of a discovery pressed down on his shoulders. The way a historian stands when the archive speaks, and the only appropriate response is to listen. "I need one more thing," he said. "Name it." The signal, The broadcast. When my survey is complete and I return to the compact, will you continue transmitting? The warden looked at him with an expression that was neither surprised nor unsurprised. It was the expression of a custodian who has heard every version of this question and knows the only answer. The signal has run for 87,000 years, she said. It will run for 87,000 more, and 87,000 after that. It will run until the magma cools and the transmitter fails and the last stone of this archive erodes into dust. And when that happens, someone will build another transmitter and start again. She looked at the bowl in its case, and her expression softened into something Sethal would spend the rest of his career trying to describe accurately and never quite succeeding. We do not stop keeping things, she said. That is the one lesson we learned from your departure that we never unlearned. When something is left behind, someone must keep it. When a voice falls silent, someone must remember what it said. We did not choose this work because it was strategic or because it served our interests. We chose it because it was necessary, because the alternative was a universe in which things disappear and no one notices. Sethal Own, compact historian, author of 11 volumes documenting the civilizations his people had abandoned, stood in a cold chamber 14 levels below the surface of a world his people had judged insignificant, and understood finally, completely, without reservation, that he had been wrong about everything. Not about the facts were correct. The compact had surveyed Earth, classified its people, and left. That was documented, that was true. But the conclusion he had drawn from those facts, the conclusion his entire career had been built on, the conclusion that the compact's abandoned worlds were tragedies waiting to be catalogued, was wrong. Earth was not a tragedy. Earth was an answer. The answer to the question that every abandoned thing asks when it is left behind. Will anyone remember that I was here? On Earth, the answer had been yes. For 120,000 years, without interruption, without conditions, without asking anything in return, the answer had been yes. He turned to Tessin. His research assistant was standing in the doorway, her datapad in her hands, her dark eyes wet, her face composed with the professional discipline of someone who understood that this moment would be recorded and that the record mattered more than the tears. Behind her in the corridor, Veli stood with his weapon holstered and his arms at his sides, and his face carrying an expression that Sethal had never seen on a soldier before, the expression of a man who has realized that his armor, his training, and his entire concept of strength are inadequate to the thing he is witnessing. Final log entry, Sethal said. Archive Survey Earth Day 4. Tessin activated the recorder. Sethal looked at the bowl in its case. He looked at the warden, standing quiet and patient beside it. He looked at the walls of the chamber, the amber light, the careful engineering of a civilization that had spent 120,000 years keeping a promise it was never asked to make. They kept everything, he said. They kept our tools and our art and our language and the faces of our dead. They kept a broken bowl that a child found in the dirt. They did not keep these things because they owed us or because they feared us or because they wanted something from us. They kept them because they believed that what exists deserves to survive, and they held that belief for longer than we have held any belief about anything. He paused. The silence in the chamber was perfect, the silence of a room designed for exactly this kind of listening. Final assessment, he said. The compact classified this species as having no significant cultural output. The compact was wrong. Their cultural output is the preservation of ours, and it is the most significant thing I have ever recorded. The recorder blinked. Tessin saved the file. The warden said nothing. Above them, on the surface, the sun was setting over the plateau. The carved panels on the hills caught the last light and held it. The signal continued its broadcast into the darkening sky, a single note, steady, patient, unchanging, aimed at the stars where it had been aimed for 87,000 years. And in the cold chamber, 14 levels down, the bowl sat in its case, cracked and mended, waiting for the next person who would come to look at it and understand what it meant to keep something that someone else had thrown away.